Now let's get going. What I've done is I've created a folder called as 09 projects, and inside this folder I've created one more folder called as project 1 cache register, and I also have this file inside my project. So let me open up this project in a new window. So I can say code, and here it is. So now let's start writing our code. Let us see our outline. Here you can see that we have 4 different objects that are required. So let's start with one of them at a time. Let us create the first file for our customer. So it's going to be customer.py. This is going to be class of customer, and let me define my init method. It's going to be self, and let us go back to the document, and here we can see we already know the instance variables and the type. The 2 variables would be first name and the last name. Let me just collapse my sidebar. So let's create the init method for the first name and the last name. So let me go over here. So my first name is a string, my last name is also a string, and this returns nothing. Here I can say that my self.first name is equal to my first name, and then my self.last name is equal to my last name. Let us create an wrapper method for this as well. So let me say self, this always returns a string, and this can return a very simple string saying that this is a class for customer. Let me add some documentation for the class as well. Okay, so this is the class for the customer details. Now let us create the str method. So this takes in a self and returns a string. So we can say I simply want to return self dot first name, and I also require my self dot last name. Let us go back and see which is the next item. So the next object that we want to create is for an item. So let me open up my sidebar. Let me create a new file called as item.py, and let's see what are the different parameters required. So item requires 4 different instance variables: id of the type of integer, name, string, price, float, and measurement unit, which is going to be a string. So let me go back to my file of items.py, and I can say my class of item. Let me add some documentation. Then let's create our init method. So I can say my init self. The first one was the id, the type is integer. The next one was name, the type is a string. Next one was price, the type is a float. The last one was measurement unit. This is going to be our string. This returns nothing. Let us create the instance variable. So self.id is equal to my id, then self.name is equal to the name, self.price is equal to my price, and self.measurement unit is equal to my measurement unit. Let me add a small comment over here. So our measurement unit could be a kg or ml or so on. Next, let us create the repr method. So I can say wrapper self returns a string, and I can say return that this is a class of item. Next, let us create the str method. So str self, this returns a string, and we can say return, then we can put the name of the item, and let's display the price. So let's say it's going to be dollars, and it's self.price per unit. So we can say self.measurement unit. Let's go to the document and see which is the next thing that we want to create. So the next thing is invoice item. Things get a little more interesting from here. If you see the instance variable, the first one is an item, but the type is an item. So please keep that in mind. And for this class, we also have a method called as get subtotal, and this method returns the subtotal after adjusting for the discount and for the quantity. So let's create one more file right over here. Let me call it as invoice item.py. Let me collapse my sidebar, and let's say this is going to be class of my invoice item. Let me add some documentation. Let's create the init file, init self. The first argument is for an item and the type is item, but this is not going to work because we don't have item in this file. Let us import it from the module. So we can just go right over here and we can say from the module of my item, I want to import the class of item. Now this will work. The next argument was for quantity and the type was integer. The last one is for discount. The type is a float. Here we can do one more trick. We can assign the values right over here. So that means if the user does not provide an argument for discount, that means by default the discount would be assigned a value of 0. So this is a very convenient feature of Python. Now this is going to return none. Self.item is equal to my item. Self.quantity is equal to my quantity. Self.my discount is equal to my discount. Now let's see what else we require. So we also require a method called as get subtotal. So let's create that method. But before that, let us create our wrapper and str method. So let me write my wrapper takes a self, returns a string, and it can return saying that this is a class of invoice item. The next is for my string, takes the self and returns an str, and let us create a nice string for this. So we can say the item and let us display the self. Now here I want to display the name of the item, and we can get the name of the item through our type of item. So we can say self dot item dot name. So if you go to the definition of item, you can see we have an instance variable of name. So this is what we are trying to refer right over here. Next we can say the quantity and let us display self dot quantity. Then let us display the discount. So we can say this is dollars and it is self dot discount. We can also display the subtotal. We have not yet created this, but we will create it shortly. So let me write it first and then we will create it. So I can say subtotal would be self dot get subtotal. Remember, we have not yet created this method, but we will create it shortly. And let's do one more small trick over here. Let us display only 2 decimal places. We can do that by using the syntax. So we can say colon, and we just want 2 decimal places for our float. Now this line looks a little longer, so let us try to divide it. So let me take this line and let us put a bracket, opening one and the closing one. Let me take it inside and let me cut all of these things till here, and let me go to the next line and let me paste it over here. Okay, so this looks much better. Now this is complaining because we don't have this method till now. Let us go and create this method. So we can say define get subtotal. This just takes the self and this returns the float. Now let us see how we can get the subtotal. What I'm going to do is I am going to use a very simple trick. In fact, I'm going to define a private member right over here. So let me put up a comment saying that this is a private member. Let me call it as self dot underscore subtotal. Now remember, since I want this variable to be kept as private, that's why I'm using underscore right over here. Now Python does not have a concept of private and public, but this symbolizes to other developers that we want to keep this variable as private. Now let's just calculate the subtotal, which is pretty easy. So we require the price from the item multiplied by the quantity and minus the discount. Now let us go back to this method get subtotal and we simply have to return it. So I can say self dot subtotal. The reason why we are doing all of these things is I don't want any other developer or any other user to accidentally change my subtotal. I want it to be kept as private. That's why I'm using this method. You can also create a property called as subtotal which is also a valid solution. You can definitely do that. But right now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just creating a private member. Let us go back to the document and see what is next. So the next one that we want to create is for the cash register itself. So this is the cash register. Note the types that we have over here. Customer is of the type of customer. Then we have the next instance variable items. The type is an dictionary. Then we have the purchase date. The type is date time. And we have a couple of methods on this as well. Let us create a new file right over here and call it as cash register.py. Let me collapse my sidebar and we can say my class of cash register. Let me add some documentation that this is the cash register for each customer. Then we can define the init method, so self. So as we just saw, the first argument is for the customer, the type is customer. We also need to import customer, which we will do shortly. We also need to have one more for the items, and that is a dictionary, and we need one more for the date. But before we can finish all of this definition, let me first go and import customer. So I can say from the module of customer, I want to import my customer. Now let me go down over here. This returns none. Here I want you to wait and think how to create the instance variable in this case. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to accept items over here. Instead, let us create an instance variable directly. First, let us say self.customer is equal to my customer. Here we can say self.items is equal to an empty dictionary. Just imagine before purchasing anything, the basket is always empty. So that's what we are saying. This has to be items. So that's what we are saying, since we don't have any items inside our checkout. That's why let us assign an empty dictionary to it. But here, how do we define what are going to be the keys and what are going to be the values of this dictionary? Let us write the type hint right over here. Items is my dictionary, but what are the types? Which is the key and which is the value? Let us go back to our design document and try and see what we exactly want. This is a small trick right over here. If you see the design of items, items is actually a dictionary, and inside this dictionary we have the key is of the type of a string. So let us go back to our definition right over here, and we can say the key is going to be of the type of string. Now let's see what is going to be the type of value. So let us go back. The value is of the type of invoice type. So if you remember, inside the invoice item, we have fields for the discount, name, quantity, and we are also calculating the subtotal. So what we can do is, inside the cash registry, we can have the value which is of the type of invoice item. So I can say invoice item. Let us go up and let us also import so that we can use it. So I can say from my module of invoice item, I want to import the class of invoice item. So remember, whenever we are creating these items, the key is always going to be the string. So if we just go back to the design document, here it is inside the items, the key is always going to be the name of the item, and the value is always going to be of the type of invoice type. Let us go back to the class. The next one that we want is for the purchase date. Now we have already seen it earlier. We can automatically create the purchase date by using our date time library. And that's what we are going to do in this document as well. First, let us go and import. So I can say from date time, I want to import my date time, and let us create an instance variable. We can call it as self.purchase date, and we can generate this automatically by using date time, and we want today's date time. So we can just say now. Let us go down and let us create the wrapper and the str method. So I can say this is my repr self returns a string, and I can say return that this is a class of cash register. Let us also define an str method. We can say self, it returns a string. Here we can just return and Here we can say first I want to display my customer. So let us display my customer. Now what's going to happen right over here is we are simply calling self.customer. And if you go to the customer, so let me open up my customer file. The str of customer file returns a string in this format, first name and the last name. So whenever we are printing this customer, by default we will get the first and the last name together. We don't have to say customer.first name and last name. It's not required. Next, let us also display the total number of items. So we can say total items, and we can get that from the length of our items. So let us go back to the document. Here it is. So items is a dictionary. We have 3 keys: apple, egg and milk. So that means we have a length of 3. Till now we have been using length with lists, but we can also use length with dictionaries as well. And when you use length with dictionary, it's always going to count the number of items. So that's what we want right over here. So total items is the length of my self.items. Let us now implement the different methods for this one. Let us see which methods we require. So let me scroll a little up. So we require methods to add, update, remove and so on. First, let us see how we can add items to our cash register. So let us go back. Let us create a new method called as add item. By default, the first argument is self. Now let's see which are the arguments we need to accept. If we have to add an item, we need to know what's the item. So the first argument is going to be an item. The type is going to be an item. Let us go and import item as well. So I can say from my module of item, let me import my class of item. Let us go back to this method. Now, since we know which is the item, we also need to know how much is the quantity. So this is going to be an integer. And we also need to know how much is a discount. So discount is going to be a float. We can do one more trick over here. If quantity and discount are not given, we can set some default values. So by default, the discount would be 0, and by default, the quantity will always be 1. So this returns a none. So let me write none over here. Let me add some documentation and let us see how we can write the body of this function. Now the first thing is we would like to add an item to a cart only if it is not existing. If we already have this item inside our cash register, we can simply update it. We don't have to add it. So the first check would be for this one. So I can say if my item dot name not in my self of items. First, let us type it out and then I will explain what's happening. So let us go to the next line. Here I want to create a new item, but if you scroll up, the key is a string, the value is an invoice item. So that's what I am going to create right over here. If you find it a little confusing, just go with the flow, and after we are done typing this function, I will explain what's happening. So here I want to create a new item is equal to, the type is an invoice item, so create an instance of my invoice item, and let's see what it takes. It takes an item, quantity and discount that we already have right over here. We just need to pass all of those inside. So the first is for the item, second is my quantity, third is my discount. The next thing that I want to do is I want to set the key and value pairs. Again, let us first type it out and then I will try and explain. So I can say my self dot items. Now here the key is going to be a string. So this is the part that we are working on. The key is the string and the value is the invoice item. So if you refer the document, I want the key to be the name of the item. So that's what we are going to do right over here. Let us go down and we can say that the key has to be the name of the item and the value is the new item which we just created. Now let us go to the next line. What happens if this item is already existing inside our registry? So we can say else we simply want to print out we can say item dot name. Already in cart, you want to update instead. Let me take out one more extra comma, we don't require this one. Now let me try and explain what's happening right over here. Let us go back to this document. Now let's see how the logic goes. So suppose this is my IPython shell. Let me create my cache register. For now it can be an empty dictionary. So this is all good. Now let us go to this line. Our cache register has one key which is called as item, and the value is of the type of dictionary itself. So let us do that over here. So we can say for my register, I want to create one key which is called as items. Sorry, it has to be items, and this is an empty dictionary. Let us try to print it out. So this is how our register is looking right now. We can also use the if and in syntax when working with our dictionaries. Suppose we want to check if our dictionary has one key which is called as items or not. So we can say items in register, and that is true. Let us check for customer in the register. So that's false because we don't have a key called as customer inside the register. We can use the same syntax when referring to items as well. Remember, items is also a type of dictionary. Let us assign some values to these items, and then we can check for the if and in conditions. Let me copy all of this. I just want this one, and we can say for my directory of register, I want you to go to my directory of items. Now what we can do is, since this is a directory, we can also create new keys and new values over here. So here I can say I want to create a new key for my apple, and the value is this one we just copied right over here. So let me just paste it over here. So this is the value, and that's it. Let me just clear all of this. Let us try to see how the register is looking right now. So this is how it is looking. Inside the register we have a key called as items, and inside the items we have apple as of now. Let us copy and paste one more product, this one. So let me copy this, and we can use the same syntax. So I want to say register is a directory. I want you to go and find the key of items. Here let us create another key by the name of eggs, and let us assign a value of this thing to it, and that's it. Let me clear it, and let us see how our register is looking now. So here we have it. First we have an apple which is right over here, and then we have an egg. Now let us check if a particular product is inside our items or not. So we can say apple in my register. I want to access my dictionary of items, and in this dictionary, so from year to year, we want to see if we have any keys called as apple. We do have, so the answer of this one should be true, and that's it. We have the answer of true. Let us try to search if we have milk inside our items or not. So let me just go and change this from apple to milk. False. We don't have milk inside our items. Now if I just flip the statement, so if I say milk not in, now let's see what we get as the response. So the response is true. Milk is not in my registry. Now since my milk is not there inside my register, only then I would like to add it. If it is existing, then I would simply like to update it. Now let us go back to our code and try to relate what's happening. So let us have a look at this line at line number 24. I am just trying to check if an item is existing in our items or not. On line number 26, so items is our dictionary. The key is going to be the name of the item. So that's what I've taken right over here. And we are assigning this item to the key that we just created, and we have a beautiful structure in place. But this function is not yet complete. The moment we add one item, we also need to update our total, otherwise our logic would be wrong. So let's see how to do that. In order to store the total invoice value, we would also require one more additional instance variable. So let us create one private this time. So we can say this is a private member, and I can say self dot invoice total. Initially, let us set it to 0. I want the type to be a float instead of an integer. Now what happens right over here? Whenever we are adding an item, we also need to increase the invoice total. That's pretty simple. So we can simply say self dot underscore invoice total plus equal to, and we can say my new item dot get subtotal. Remember, when we created this invoice item, we implemented this method to calculate the subtotal. And why do we need this method? Because we have to adjust for the quantity and discount. And that's what we are using right over here. So this method gives us the subtotal for the new item, which we simply want to add to our invoice total. But the issue is this method is not reliable. What happens if we have a typo? Instead of plus we have a minus, or we need to do some other validation logic before we can increase the total? The answer is, let us create one function that will increase the subtotal. So let's create one method right over here. So we can say increase the invoice total. The first argument would be obviously the self. Now let's see what argument should we take. If we go down, we can get the subtotal if we have the access to our new item. The type of this new item is an invoice item. So that's what we need to get right over here. So this function accepts an item which is of the type of invoice item, and this returns nothing. Let us add a documentation saying that this increments the total invoice value each time an item is added. Let us go down and let us take this line. This is what we are exactly doing right over here. Let me paste it, and let us change the name of the variable, because the variable we are calling it as just the item over here. So this is the item. Let us go below and use this newly created function. Here we can say I want to self dot, I want to increment my invoice total, and I simply need to pass the new item inside of this. So new item. The last modification that I want to do over here is I want to keep this method as private. I don't want any other developer to accidentally change my logic. Let us go down and let me update this syntax as well. Now we have a beautifully typed and a much more stable code. And while we are here, let us create one more method to decrease or decrement the invoice total. Whenever we are deleting an item from the register, we would also need one method to decrease the subtotal. So let's do it right now. Let me copy and paste all of this. The name changes from increment to decrement. This also changes to decrement, and this becomes removed, and this becomes minus equal to, and that's it.